Seeking Level, Chapter 2. This scenario repeated itself for the remainder of the night. Keith would wake, check Lance, clear his throat, try to find a warmer position, then close his eyes again. He had no way to tell how long he slept at each interval, and he lost track of how many times he woke up. At one point, he thought he saw the castle overhead, looking like the only star in the galaxy, but he wasn't sure. Lance breathed steadily throughout the night, the only reassuring sound in the unnatural quiet of this dead planet. Keith shivered against him, eyes closed, waiting for the warmth of daybreak. Light was just making its way down into the canyon, long before the temperature would increase, when Keith gave up trying to sleep anymore. His muscles were stiff and aching from lying on the hard earth, from all that he'd asked of them yesterday. Carefully, he extracted himself from Lance, pushing himself upright and looking around. There was no bird song down here. He put on his helmet, thinking about backtracking to where he'd left Blue, to see if she were functional, to see if she'd let him pilot her if it meant saving her true paladin. He'd done it once before with the Black Lion. It wasn't a completely crazy plan. He'd gone about 6 steps, thinking incredulously the entire time about how he'd actually run down this yesterday with Lance on his back, when an unexpected sound stopped him. He paused, unsure what it might be. It was somewhere between a growl and a moan, then a hesitant, "Hello?" that Keith recognized instantly. Lance had woken up. Pivoting on the spot, Keith barreled back to where he'd left Lance against the rock, coming to his side just as he was pushing himself up to a sitting position. One hand on the ground behind him, Keith greeted, skidding to his knees beside him, amazed at how happy he was to see him up and moving. But before he could say anything else, Lance shocked him with a heavy shove against his chest, followed with a clumsy punch that didn't land, but Keith suspected Lance had been aiming for his face. "Stay back!" Lance threatened, shoving himself to his feet, but swaying in such a way that he'd only be up for a couple seconds. Keith tried again to get close, grabbing Lance by the shoulders to keep him from collapsing on the rocks, but again Lance twisted desperately to get free, bringing both fists up to break Keith's grip. "Get off!" "Stop fighting me, you idiot! I'm trying to help you!" Keith shouted after Lance had ripped away from his supportive hands and stood, shaky, with his fists by his ears, boxer style. "Keith?" Lance asked, blinking quickly, and suddenly they were both confused. Keith felt his right eyebrow shoot up in astonishment as he spread his hands out to his sides, waiting for Lance to recognize him standing right in front of him. He answered sardonically, wondering what the hell Lance was doing. He didn't have long to puzzle it out before he had to step in again to catch Lance as he toppled over. This time the taller boy allowed the contact, but his weight made them both hit their knees on the ground. Keith leaned into the rock that had been their pathetic shelter last night as Lance made it clear that he'd used pretty much all his strength in their unexpected spat a moment ago. As gravity pulled them both downward, Keith ended up with Lance's head on his lap, staring down into his face. "Keith," Lance panted from where he lay on his back, his arms folded across his chest in a protective gesture. "Where are we?" "About 1,000 feet down a canyon, luckily not buried in a rock slide. Do you remember anything?" "Yeah, falling, and Blue sort of knocked me. That's it, that's all I've got." Keith studied him as he spoke, a sense of unease pricking him between his shoulders. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what. "How do you feel?" he asked, trying to figure out what Lance was looking at. Not at Keith, just up and off somewhere, right into the glare of the morning sun. "Like I just fell off a 1,000-foot cliff." Keith snorted, relieved only partly by the attempted joke. "You?" "Like I jumped down after you," he answered. "You jumped?" Lance repeated, and the absurdity of it only then hit Keith. What a stupid thing to do. And yet, he probably wouldn't change the decision if he had to make it over again. He cleared his throat, trying to move some of the muck that was still clinging there, feeling how thirsty he was for the first time. "What's going on down there?" A sleepy voice through his headset startled him. Hunk. It must have been his shift to be listening in, just in case they needed any verbal assistance down here. But Hunk could only hear Keith, not Lance. Lance's helmet had been lost in the last rock slide. It up, sort of. Mostly, he leaned against the rock, resting his head against it with his eyes closed. "You talking to Lance?" "Yeah," Keith confirmed, monitoring his teammate with concern and standing. "He's awake." "That's fantastic!" Hunk exclaimed, waking up completely. "That'll make this easier." "Make what easier?" Keith asked, even though he didn't want to. The odds of it being any kind of easy were likely in the slim to none range. Now that the sun was warming the canyon, all he really wanted to do was sleep another few hours, after he drank a glass of water the size of a child's swimming pool. "So, Pidge and I stayed up way late last night working out how to get you guys up. Because, we can't take the lions anywhere near you without risking crushing you or burying you alive." Keith nodded, forgetting again that Hunk couldn't actually see him do it. "Anyway, the best thing to do seems to be to have you guys walk yourselves out of the canyon." "Hunk," Keith said, overwhelmed, looking up worriedly at the crumbling sides of the canyon. "I don't know what it looks like on your monitor, but there's no way. It's way too steep." "I said walk out, not up. Obviously you can't climb out. Listen, we did some area scans, and it looks like you can follow the fall path of the canyon. Eventually it leads out to a flat area where we could bring the lions down to get you. Then once everyone is off this planet, we can dig out Blue." "Couldn't we just go back to Blue and fly her out?" Keith asked hopefully. Now that Lance was awake, that seemed the best option. "Yeah, no, sorry. The rock slide yesterday completely buried her. The other lions are the only way we're getting her out at this point." Keith sighed resolutely. Of course she was buried. Of course there was no other way out. "How far is eventually in, say, miles?" Keith mused, peering as far as possible the direction Hunk was thinking he should go. All he could see were the towering shadows of the canyon walls Hunk was thinking he should go. All he could see were the towering shadows of the canyon walls, which could suddenly cave in on them at any point. On the plus side, there was absolutely no way to get lost. "Yeah, it's kind of far. We're guessing about 23 miles. It'll take you all of today for sure, but you should be able to make it out by tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Keith squawked, coming to terms with the idea that he would have to spend another night in this pit. "Keith? What?" Lance asked, still on the ground, leaning on the rock, only hearing half the conversation and not being able to take it anymore. But he wasn't ready to repeat it yet. He had to process it first. He wasn't even sure if Lance could walk, much less perform the kind of acrobatics it was going to take to follow that angled line for 23 grueling miles. But with Blue buried and the canyon walls so unstable, what else were they going to do? "What are they saying?" "All right, Hunk. We'll get moving," Keith acknowledged the plan reluctantly. "We're here, man." They were there, voices in his head. But it was only him and Lance down here in the dirt with absolutely zero supplies. "Keith," Lance began again, not liking being ignored. "What's the plan? They're not coming to get us?" "Apparently there's only one way out of here," Keith told him. "And it's 23 miles that way." He gestured down the fall path, feeling all the places on his body that were probably bruised. He cleared his throat again. Lance pushed himself to his feet, using the rock for balance. His face had changed. He suddenly looked terrified. It freaked Keith out. "Come on," he commanded, nodding his head the way they were going to start, needing them to get moving so he could push away whatever anxiety was trying to do to his head. "You can walk, right?" "Keith," Lance said very slowly, "what do you mean, that way? How can you tell what way is anything when it's absolutely pitch black down here?" "What are you talking about?" Keith responded, suddenly cold again. He stepped close to Lance, right in front of Ark. "Keith," Lance repeated in a tone that sounded rather like a warning, holding out a hand, which touched Keith on the chest first, but Lance slid it up so that it rested on his shoulder. "There's absolutely no light here at all, and that's not funny." The solemnity of it told Keith that he wasn't joking, that he was really scared. Keith mimicked the gesture, gripping Lance's shoulder in shock, understanding now why Lance hadn't known he was there when he woke up, why he'd been staring straight at the sun, why he couldn't tell where they were. "Please tell me you're not serious," he said, but as he spoke, he took Lance's chin in his hand and turned up his face. "Open your eyes." Lance made a strange sound, somewhere between a laugh and a cry, but he did what he was told. Keith flinched. The pupils were blown wide, almost obscuring the iris completely. Keith turned Lance's head gently, watching as they didn't react to the light of the sun. "Oh, shit." was watching as they didn't react to the light of the sun. Oh, shit. What's happening? Hunk again, listening in on the helmet radio. You guys okay? Keith! Lance cried as it hit him that he actually couldn't see, that it wasn't just because he'd fallen into some lightless hole. Keith grabbed him as the shock of this news made his knees buckle, and once again they were back on the ground where Lance had both his hands pressed tight against his face. My God! Keith! What is it? Hunk asked again. Seriously. Keith ignored his helmet. Shh, he said to them both, as Lance curled over his supporting arm in complete panic. He put a hand on Lance's back. You must have really hit your head. Lance made a sort of choking noise, struggling to tuck himself into a tiny ball with Keith's arm in the way. Keith swallowed as his throat constricted unexpectedly. He couldn't even imagine. Stop it. Hey, listen. Listen to me. He jerked Lance, who winced, then pushed him up, slightly. The tears in Lance's eyes looked weird and dangerous. Keith swallowed again hard as he noticed how there was no focus there. Can you see anything at all? Shadows, blurriness, colors, motion, anything? No, Lance whimpered, his breathing speeding up in a scary way. Nothing. There's nothing, Keith! Okay, Keith started repeating reflexively. He shifted his hands from Lance's face to his shoulders, as if that would hold him together. Okay, that's okay. We're going to get out of here. It'll be fine. Lance's internal struggle was evident in his breathing. He was trying to calm himself down, but Keith could tell that even though the leash on his panic was tight, it was also brittle and likely to snap any second. Come on, stand up, Keith ordered, physically lifting Lance off the ground. We're getting out of here. It's going to be okay. I can't, Lance moaned, and Keith wondered if that were actually the case. Even though he was standing, lay that way on his own. He'd tilted his head to one side, his eyes tightly closed, and one hand pressed against his temple. Keith pondered the possibility of carrying him. He'd done it yesterday with the help of his good friend Adrenaline, but 23 miles. Yes, you can, Keith assured, trying to convince himself. Keith? Keith! A new voice on the helmet radio now. Allura had joined the party. What? Keith asked, not as politely as he'd intended. As soon as he'd answered, he regretted it, then immediately scanned his surroundings in case what Allura had been doing was warning him of another rock slide nearby. I'm sorry, he admitted. Go ahead. From what I can piece together from what you're saying, I'm taking it that Lance has been blinded? Whenever Allura talked, it always reminded Keith of running water. It made him swallow repeatedly, trying not to gag on the clump of dirt clinging to the sides of his throat. Yeah, he confirmed, and then gently began tugging Lance forward. Come on, Lance. Take a step. Without consciously thinking about it, Lance took the step to keep contact with Keith, trembling with the effort and the fear. Keith took another step backward, repeating the whole process, readjusting the pressure he had on Lance with each of their shuffling footsteps as he got acquainted with just how messed up Lance's balance was at the moment. Even as he moved, Lance was whimpering protests, but so long as he kept moving, Keith didn't acknowledge or respond. Is there an actual eye injury? Allura continued as they began to slowly make their way from the rock where they'd spent the night. Bleeding? Puncture? No, nothing like that, Keith answered, keeping his voice calm and steady, hoping that Lance was so focused on whatever he was mumbling to himself that he wasn't really listening as he tried to diagnose what had happened with someone who wasn't actually present and actually hadn't been studying the workings of a human body all that long. I think he hit his head really hard, just right. I agree, and that's both good and bad. Keep going, Keith said both to Lance and to the princess. It's good in that his vision is likely to return to normal. Uh-huh, Keith encouraged, mentally preparing himself not to react, at least verbally, to the bad news when it came. But it means that what is actually injured here is Lance's brain. Can you make out a head wound of any kind? No, Keith answered, looking hard at Lance, then over his shoulder to where he should step next, then back at Lance. His skull was intact. He'd checked that yesterday. Whatever was going on, it was all internal and invisible. That's worrisome, Allura said, unnecessarily. Can he move unassisted? He's walking, Keith answered, tightening his right arm as Lance lurched to that side, half tripping on the uneven terrain and half just losing his balance. Not so much unassisted. Keep on then, but Watch him carefully. There's something putting pressure on the optic nerves. This pressure might continue to build, depending on the type of injury. It could kill him. So what do I do? Keith asked desperately, fixing his gaze on Lance in horror at this information that he could just keel over at any second. Given your current situation, really there would be nothing you could do. He needs a healing pod. As quickly as you can get him to us. Let us know immediately if Lance loses consciousness, if he starts slurring his words, hallucinating, vomiting, if he loses function or feeling in any of his limbs. Laura, Keith said, alarmed and overwhelmed. Isn't there some way to come down here and pick us up? We're working on that right now. This is more serious than we thought, but it's also a huge risk to take a lion or even a pod onto the planet. In the meantime, please make your way to the spot where we can get to you safely. But what if... Keith hesitated, repeating any of the horrible things she'd just told him to watch for in case Lance were listening to him. He didn't want to freak him out any more than he was already. What should I do? Unfortunately, there's really nothing you could do except be there for him in his final moments. That's the worst plan ever, Keith accused, suddenly furious. If it were up to him, the risk would be worth taking. Lance needed some help now, not 23 miles from now. I'm so sorry. If it helps at all, it could be that this is as bad as it's going to get. There is also a chance that he could begin improving. His sight could return in a matter of hours. Keith was unconvinced. Whatever, look, I need to concentrate, okay? We're going dark for a while. Keith, Alora said quickly, as if frightened he was going to do something stupid like turn off his helmet radio again. I'm here, he assured her, though bitingly. This is really hard. I know. I just wanted to tell you thanks for being so brave or so foolish yesterday. I know Lance is in good hands. I think you may be the best choice of a companion for him. Right now. Keith allowed himself an eye roll at that. He and Lance struggled to get along at the best of times. You may not believe that, Alora continued, as if she'd seen him. But just think, if anyone could motivate Lance to push just a little bit more, even if it's just for spite, that's you. Remember that. We'll check in later, Keith said, not knowing what else to respond. Someone's on rock slide watch up there. Of course. We're also getting some supplies together for you. I'm just not sure how we will get them down there yet. That would be great, but Alora... Yes? Her voice was hopeful, almost desperate, and for a second Keith understood how awful she felt, how powerless, how she wished she could do more for him, how she hated that her hands were tied like this. If it's a choice between final moments and a potential slide, we are agreed on the slide, right? If it comes to that, but I really don't want to risk it, darkly, but decided against saying it out loud. He'd voiced his opinion, but they were at the mercy of others' decisions right now. The people making the choices were hovering above the atmosphere, watching on a monitor the seismic activity of the surface layer. Final moments, Keith? Lance repeated in a shaky, quiet voice. What's that? Keith responded, playing dumb, realizing his mistake. If he'd been trying to keep secrets from Lance, that hadn't been the best thing to say out loud. That's what you said. Final moments. Lance sounded so scared, so out of his element. Keith cleared his throat ineffectively. What's that mean? I did not, he denied. Are we going to die down here? Lance tried to get more information, absolutely terrified. No, Keith said sharply, shaking his head for emphasis before remembering that it would be a worthless gesture right now. It's not going to happen. We sure as hell not dying down here, got me? Now keep walking. His voice sounded harsh to him, had to keep moving. Hopelessness would be one of their worst enemies, and Lance was really close to giving in to it. Then what did you say? Lance demanded as he shuffled clumsily over the terrain, but there was no way Keith was repeating anything he'd just talked about. He said, the sound catching and making him cough. Don't worry about it. Just keep moving. They struggled together for a while, Keith noticing how terribly slow their progress was, how awkward their movements. Lance gripped his arms hard, sometimes forced to put all his weight into Keith to avoid falling. It seemed every few steps that his knees would give way, forcing Keith to twist, catching him under the arms and bracing him against his hip. Keith, Lance began again, and Keith tried to take a deep breath of patience. Even blind and stuck on a deserted planet, Lance would not keep his mouth shut. Where's Blue? Ah, sure. That one made sense. Keith forgave him this question. That one made sense. Keith forgave him this question. If it had been him, he would want to know where his lion was, too. She's behind us, he answered, trying to be gentle about it. You weren't buried in the slide yesterday, but she was. The other lions will have to dig her out. Do you think she's okay? I can't hear her or feel her or anything. This comment stung Keith harder almost than anything else Lance had said. He hadn't been a paladin very long, but now that he knew what that bond felt like, to be connected to that huge ancient consciousness, he couldn't imagine having that taken away from him, especially at a time like this when that constant presence in his head was a steady comfort, energy he could borrow. Even though Red was high above him, safe in the castle, he could still feel her strength inside his psyche, and knew that if anyone asked, he could point directly to her in an instant. But Lance couldn't. He'd been forced to ask where Blue was, and that made him worry. Would sentience in the machine die? And how would that affect Lance, now that he couldn't tap into such a powerful connection? It wasn't just the loss of his sight that was bothering him. She's going to be okay, just like you, Keith assured, not knowing if he were lying or not, but willing to say just about anything to Lance right now if it helped him at all. But we need to get off the planet first before we can dig her out. I bet Hunk can do it in less than a minute. How far is it again? Lance repeated, already sounding exhausted, his voice dark, tinged with the hopelessness that Keith was also struggling to keep at bay. Just keep going, Keith reminded him. Don't think about it. The canyon warmed as the sun moved over them, but it never actually got all the way down to where they were. The dust in the air that never fully settled made the whole place seem to shimmer in the sunbeams that did make it past the steep cliffsides. From time to time they could hear echoes of the rocks as they tumbled down the walls. The castle didn't say anything about these other slides, but it wasn't like times he heard the ominous rumbling of the canyon collapsing on itself. He froze every time, disrupting their momentum, staring all around as if he could determine the location of the sound, pleading silently each time that it wasn't close by, that it wouldn't set off some sort of chain reaction that would bring the entire thing down at once. Lance stopped speaking, and even though Keith was rather hoping not to have to talk for a while, he found he missed the chatter. A quiet Lance was strange and uncomfortable. Keith kept a close eye on him, even though it was almost physically painful to look at him. Lance's head lolled to one side, like it wasn't worth the effort to hold it up, looking like some sort of animated corpse. He hunched over their hands, shuffling instead of walking, not trusting his footing or Keith's encouragement that he wasn't going to fall. Keith had to pull him at every step, and if he did stumble, which was often, it took even more tugging to get him to start moving forward again. It took even more tugging to get him to start moving forward again. There was so much effort involved in moving just a few inches. Periodically, Lance would just stop short, his breath catching sharply as his face twisted up in pain. Keith's heart would stop too as he watched, tightening his hold on his teammate, wondering if this were a symptom Alora had mentioned. "What's up?" he asked the first few times, trying to be nonchalant, not wanting to clue Lance in that he was monitoring him for a ruptured aneurysm or something equally fatal. "Nothing," Lance would insist, making Keith bite his tongue. Obviously it wasn't nothing. "Then let's go," Keith prompted, and they would start moving again. He continued to try and clear his throat, never completely dislodging the ball of mud that was drying there. It became harder and harder to even swallow as his mouth became dry and sticky. The discomfort made him cough, twisting his head into the crook of his elbow carefully so as to not shift Lance's balance too much. It took off balance right now. "You all right?" Lance asked him as the coughing got more and more frequent. "Yeah," Keith assured when he could talk again after another episode. "Just got something in the back of my throat from trying to dig you out yesterday." "I guess there's no such thing as water down here, is there?" Lance asked, half hopeful and half resolute. Keith swallowed reflexively at the mention of a drink. His lips were already sticking together in a distractingly uncomfortable manner. "There's nothing down here at all, except rocks and dirt. There aren't even any trees," Keith answered, all resolute. "That explains why the ground is so unstable," Lance mused. "No roots to hold anything together." Lance's foot caught on a rock that Keith had neglected to mention to him. His immediate reaction was to crumple at the knees rather than fall forward, which pulled him out of Keith's steadying grip. He lost his balance and crashed to one side, catching his upper arm on a sharp rock and wedging his foot between two more. He grunted in pain, and Keith winced for him this time. "Sorry," he apologized, crouching down to help get him upright again. "There's a rock there." "Too late," Lance muttered between clenched teeth, covering his arm with his free hand. Keith shifted the rock to free his foot as he recovered from the fall, then grabbed at Lance's wrists to haul him up. Lance gripped back, doing his best to get to his feet. They stood together, but almost immediately Lance hunched forward again, forcing Keith to brace himself to accommodate the extra weight leaning on his forearms. "Come on," he grunted, losing his patience, hating how this was going. "Wait," Lance panted, resting his head on the back of their joined hands. "We really can't do that," Keith admonished, scanning their surroundings. Nothing but canyon walls as far as he could see, and no way to tell how much daylight they had left. "I know, I'm just so dizzy." Keith mouthed a swear word, looking around again as if for some assistance, some way out that he hadn't noticed before. As he tried to think, coming up with nothing, Lance slowly straightened. "Okay," Lance said, unconvincingly. "Better?" Keith checked, bending to look up into his face, as if that would tell him anything helpful. His eyes remained closed tightly. It made him more comfortable when they were closed. It kept the panic in check. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, not enough spit to make the motion as smooth as it usually was. "Lance?" "Better," Lance agreed, again unconvincingly. "All right," Keith said, relieved. He cleared his throat unsuccessfully, coughing a bit. "Then let's go." And they pressed on, the list of aches and discomforts growing in both number and intensity. Sometimes Lance's breathing would get away from him as it hit him again that he was blind. Panic would seize him and he would cry out, and once he'd stopped moving, his knees would threaten to give out on him. Each time, Keith would grab him with one arm around his waist, the other around the back of his neck to keep him grounded and upright. "I can't see," Lance would sob, slicing into Keith's soul. He would close his eyes too, and put pressure on Lance wherever he touched him to distract him from thinking about it too hard, to keep him fixed where he was, on the mission at hand. "Shh," he'd say. I know, but it's going to be all right. We'll get out of here, tuck you in a healing pod, and it'll be like it never happened." "But what if it doesn't work?" Lance would always ask, but Keith would not accept that scenario. "It will, but we have to get there, so come on." And the pulling would start over, breaking into their lurching shuffle again. Lance asked more questions between bouts of panic, pain, and silence, nervous, frightened questions about the terrain, about the plan, about the time, and about the others. The castle, too, would ask questions, sometimes to Keith and sometimes to Lance. Keith answered what he could, acting as a relay between the voice was deserting him, that it was a physical struggle to get any words past his raw throat. In the end, after another question from Lance that was actually for Hunk, he snatched his helmet off his head and plunked it onto Lance's, almost knocking him over with the abruptness of the act. "Here, ask him yourself," he snapped, "and don't stop." Lance bit his lips, head bowed under the new weight of the helmet. His expression tightened as he turned his face away from Keith. He pretended not to notice, and pulled him another step, making another attempt to get an effective swallow. Once he was no longer an active participant in a conversation, time drew out into something meaningless. He tuned in and out of what Lance was saying to their teammates. He heard fragments of Lance's side of the chat, but since he couldn't piece the whole thing together, he let his thoughts drift, finding it difficult to concentrate on anything other than how thirsty he was, how tired his arms were from trying to keep Lance from falling, from wondering how far they had come and how much longer they were going to have to be out here. Lance once again stopped short, which was starting to grate on his nerves. He knew that Lance was struggling, that this was hard for him, but why couldn't he understand that it wasn't going to get any better unless they got the hell out of this pit? He was about to say just this until he saw the expression on Lance's face. It was a different sort of panic this time. "What's happening?" Lance shouted into the helmet abruptly. "What's going on up there?" His fingers clenched into Keith's arms painfully. "What?" Keith asked, even though he'd been on the other side of this type of interaction and knew that Lance had to pay more attention to the helmet radio than to him. "No!" Lance almost screamed, his strength failing him. Keith let him down as gently as he could, dropping to his knees beside him, trying to read what was going on by staring at the expressions of horror that passed over his features in waves. "Guys! Hunk!" Guys? Then he just went limp, hunching over his knees, touching his forehead to the earth in despair, making Keith twitchy. What? Hunching over his knees, touching his forehead to the earth in despair, making Keith twitchy. What? He yelled, not coping at all with the drama of watching without knowing what was going on. An attack, Lance finally answered in a broken, dead voice. Zarkon. Keith stood up a little too quickly at the news, simultaneously scanning the skyline and shooting a hand out to catch himself on the nearest supporting boulder as his vision blurred from the abruptness of his motion. He knew where the castle was, or had been, but here inside the planet's atmosphere, down this far beneath the surface, there was no way to physically see what was going on. They're trying to lure the fight away from us, Lance explained, a little calmer. They haven't done a wormhole jump, but they're out of range now. And we're on our own, Keith continued unnecessarily. He let himself drop down again next to Lance, leaning against the rock he'd already used to steady himself, sorting through this news. How large was the attack? A scout? A warship? How were they going to fare with only 3 working lions and the castle defenses? His thoughts moved from outer space closer in as he then wondered what they were going to do. They'd been moving slowly, but he honestly thought that Pidge and Hunk would have worked out a better plan than the 23-mile hike before too long, or at least that they could figure out how to get them some water. And now they were gone, and maybe they weren't coming back. Keith, Lance began, but Keith didn't want to hear anything he had to say. I don't know, he answered to every possible thing that Lance would be about to say to him. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. I have no idea. And here he'd thought it couldn't get any worse. He heard Lance shift beside him, but he didn't move. There didn't seem to be much point. He hadn't realized how having the connection to the castle was helping him, how knowing that they were up there, monitoring them, had actually been keeping him moving. I just don't know, he said again, very softly, resisting any attempt he might have made to pull himself off the ground. He swallowed hot blades down his throat, not enough to clear it, and did his best to get a deep breath. He had to get up, had to get Lance up again. They were on their own now, but they could not stop. He just had to get up,